We have one more VERGE talk coming up. It's really, I think it's going to be kind of amazing because so much, we've talked about technology, we've talked about lots of things, but so much of this is about culture, and specifically around culture change and all of the changes that need to happen in all the different cultures. And I don't just mean that geographically or any other way, just all the business cultures and everything else. One of the things I love to say about change is that when it comes to change, we love the noun, hate the verb. We love the idea of change, but changing is hard. So to talk about how we bridge those divides and what it takes to really prove what's possible, please welcome to the stage the Cultural Sustainability Planner at PBR Hawaii, Ramsey Taum.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Mahalo, aloha. E holuku no kikino a me ka ohane. He malama pono ka manao. Ke ola, ke kino. I ka mana va'auloa. Alohe, alohe, alohe. Aloha. Thank you. Mahalo. Yeah, I figured we opened our conference and gathering together with Ole, and I thought we'd at least make an effort to close with Ole. And in those words, it says, unify mind, body, and spirit. And not just when we hear, but when we leave. The second part of that verse says, to care for, nurture, protect that unification through all time. And we have shared our minds, our bodies, and our thoughts in the last few days. And this discussion about bridging the divide is an attempt to continue moving forward and not necessarily going back anywhere. I don't think we can go back someplace, but we can certainly bring things forward. Now, the imagery that we used for our opening, and is the slides moving? Let's see if we can get that queued up. But I have found that as a community facilitator, oftentimes I am being asked to bridge these divides or these gaps and differences. And I've learned that there's a difference of becoming a bridge and being stepped on, or being a builder of bridges. And so this afternoon or this morning, it's an attempt to do that. The underlying text for my presentation is about raising the blue continent, which is really a metaphor for raising a new consciousness, because I really believe that's part and parcel with the idea of how we get there from here, which is also a divide, the divide of time. But before I start one, I'd like to acknowledge that in their opening comments, the Alan Oshima talked about accountability. The governor talked about future generations. And, oh man, I'm hitting the wrong one, right? So my intentions really have to do with addressing those comments, those concepts. Is that the intention is to be aloha, share aloha, and understand what that means. And in their comments, they're talking about the future generation. What we do now is going to have an impact on them. And this image of the empty chair is an effort to address that. The empty chair that is never empty. Our ancestors are there. Our grandchildren are there. And it speaks to accountability. It says, who are we responsible to? As we prepare a postcard for the future, one of the things I like to do is try to answer a letter from my great-grandchildren that asks me, what did I do in my present condition to help improve and create a better situation for them? It acknowledges this empty chair. Sometimes that empty chair includes what we refer to as resources. My Native American cousins on the continent refer to them as relatives. And so in the world of accounting, where it's very difficult to actually look at accountability, because it tends not to be a line item on the budget sheet, the question is, are we accountable to our relatives in the future as well as in the present? So I share the empty chair with you because it reminds us that before we speak too quickly about those not present, or about those who have no voice for themselves, that we are conscious of our accountability to them. So with that in mind then, what is the divide? What are the divides? And I would like to suggest that one of the greatest divides is the way we see the world. Our worldviews. For instance, if you just take a list of all the various kinds of divisive mechanisms, the things that separate us in many ways, you have gender, geography, politics, capacity, the ability to do things, influence, awareness, And as far as it relates to our conference here today or this week, when it comes to energy, is it imported or is it indigenous? Does it come from our place? And so how each of us looks at these particular topics has a lot to do with the methods, the practices, the principles, and the values that we approach each one, and those who may be on the other side of our view or conversation. So here's an example. Answer the question. For yourself, is it half full or half empty? Interesting enough, how you answer this question for self may be an indication of whether we are actually emptying the system or we're filling it up. I heard a comedian say once that this can also be answered a different way. It all depends on whether you're drinking or you're pouring. So the question is, are we drinking or are we pouring? And as we've heard now, it's a little of both. It's all of it. So this divide in thinking is really what I'm suggesting we need to look at. If we're going to bridge any divide, it's acknowledging firsthand, transparently, honestly with ourselves, that everything we're saying, all of our thoughts, our practices, our propositions, are already biased by something. The paradigms, our biases that allow us to enter into conversations, whether it's a good, bad, or indifferent proposition, at some point in time are rooted in these biases. And can we be conscious enough to step far enough outside those paradigms and biases to create new ways of thinking without leaving those wonderful practices of the past that got us here that are still relevant today as they were for our ancestors? And so I would like to suggest that there is a way of acknowledging that many of our conversations today are driven by supply-side thought. These are the thoughts, concepts, and principles that we've been supplied with by education, social culture, etc., etc. And unfortunately, I think as many of us know, we're now in a new context. And the content that we've been discussing up to date, this point in time, was formulated in an old context. So how do we build a bridge between an old context and a new context and create new content that we can talk about so that we're not just moving around the furniture and thinking we're actually getting anything done? We all know the adage about Einstein's thought about how do you create something new using old devices, the notion of insanity. Well, I didn't hear anything that was insane in the last couple of days, so I'm hopeful. The object now then is, how do we move from one side of the road, which is strictly problem solving, which could be, it's okay, but when do we move to creative thinking? And I am enlightened and encouraged because this gathering has demonstrated that we are at that place. We have stepped into that area of creative thinking and finding new ways. There is another divide, and we've experienced it here in the islands. In fact, the acknowledgement of where the Pacific is a good example of that. So we're going to try to resolve that as quickly as possible. There is a difference between continental thinking and island thinking. In the 16th century, these two gentlemen, Balboa and Magellan, they were out discovering, looking for things. They're out there looking for new ways, new places. Well, here's what happened. Balboa is credited with discovering the Pacific. He kind of fell in and says, ooh, water, ocean. And all of a sudden, he's now credited with discovering this new sea. Nobody told him that Pacific Islanders had been there for thousands of years. Then shortly after, this other guy named Magellan comes out, and he's now sailing around in the sea. He never gets home, by the way. But he is credited with giving the Pacific a name. Well, thanks to these great discoverers, we in the Pacific now know where we are and what to call it. Tongue-in-cheek, my point is, Euro-American thinking from elsewhere, imported to places where there was already inherent knowledge on how to live and be in one's place, was overshadowed by these other thoughts. And each of us in our own particular ways, our silos, our companies, our activities, need to at some point in time ask ourselves, how much of what am I doing today is not already influenced by the thoughts of others rather than me creating new ways of thinking? It doesn't mean it's bad. This is not an indictment. It's an observation. That unless we're careful and honest with ourselves, it could be easy for us to transport things that worked elsewhere that may not be relevant to the new place. And here in Hawaii, we've kind of discovered some of that. We have a lot of continental thinking and expansion going on a small island. How did that happen? We heard the mayor say that earlier. So is there a way of pulling things that our ancestors knew on how to live on an island into the present and prepare for the future in such a way that we are not treating the islands like a continent? Now let's expand that thought. It's not just Hawaii, but it's the planet itself. When we look at Earth as an island rather than a continent, I think the characteristics are very similar. So in some respect, we're talking about rediscovery. Rather than what Balboa and Magellan were doing, trying to discover new things, we're looking at rediscovering the ways that worked then that could be employed today. How do we explore and exploit those things and bring it forward? It may require reframing, redefining, and refocusing what that is, simply because we're using other people's definitions, right? Other lexicons. And how do we begin to make it place-based and more appropriate for where we are? For instance, those of you in Hawaii, or even anyone in the room, if you saw this image, what would you call this? Anyone? Poi pounder, or? A pond? Anyone else? A pestle, yeah. So it's a pestle or poi pounder. So here's the reframe. This is called a Hawaiian food processor. Reframe, redefine, and refocus. Once again, if we're not careful, we begin to apply the education, training, teaching aspirations of others before we begin to understand our own. So wherever we're from, is there a way of understanding that first? And then supplementing what it is we know or don't know with the successes of others and finding that optimal blend. And I think that's part of it. This isn't about saying what's right or wrong, but it's suggesting that we live on an island or in an island chain that shares the characteristics of an Earth planet called island Earth. And so is there some value in looking at the island worldview? So part of my conversation was also not to look at what the divides are and how do you bridge them, but how do we get there and what's successful? These thoughts aren't new. King David La'amea Kalakaua, the last reigning king of Hawaii, during his reign, he was actually beginning to understand this. First monarch to circumnavigate the globe. And while he was traveling, he came home and he recognized, as a small nation with limited resources, it was going to be very difficult to influence his own nation, let alone others. And so he began to explore a regional relationship, the notion of a Pacific nation, a Pacific empire. So it's quite appropriate that we actually had presentation from Japan and the recognition of an MOU, because during his time, there was actually an effort to try to unify the two kingdoms. The Crown Prince of Japan marrying the Crown Princess of Hawaii. The idea that Japan and Hawaii would come together. Very powerful concept. And here it is, all those years later, 125 years, and that's where we are. And so as we move forward, the things that can be done, the mayor mentioned it earlier, hokulea. Hokulea is accomplished what the king was looking for back then. How do we unify the blue continent, the blue planet, as a needle on the thread to create a lei of aloha and sustainability around the world? It can be done if you have a large enough vision. Now, I know his teacher told him, if you're going to navigate, you create a sail plan, and then you see the island. We have to hold the vision long enough, because if you don't, every atoll becomes a destination. So in closing, the concept of island Earth, raising the blue continent, if you think about the Pacific as a continent, water does not divide but connects. This is probably the largest single body on the planet, and we're all part of it. 3,000 islands plus 22 global economies centered around a place called Hawaii. Island Earth, complementary worldviews getting us there. And so Nainoa and Hokulea demonstrated that we can string a lei of success that begins to look at our island home as a place that we all share. Closing thought. We don't think ourselves into new ways of behaving or acting. Instead, we act ourselves into new ways of thinking. Hopefully we'll take from here what we've learned, adopt new behaviors and practices, and get us to a new place so that the glass is always full. Half water, half air, always light. And by the way, that's an LED bulb. Just imagine what we can do and what's possible. Aloha.